The words hit me like a physical blow, delivered through the speaker of my phone, with the casual indifference reserved for declining a dinner invitation. There just won't be enough space for you this year, honey. My mother's voice carried that familiar tone she used when she'd already made up her mind about something and expected me to accept it without question. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the morning coffee growing cold in my hands as 28 years of family dynamics crystallized into this single, devastating moment. The annual Martinez family retreat had been a sacred tradition for as long as I could remember. Every summer, 3 generations would descend upon the sprawling lake house in Colorado that had belonged to my grandparents. It was where cousins became best friends, where family stories were passed down like heirlooms, where my own sense of belonging had been forged through decades of shared memories. And now, apparently, there wasn't room for me. What do you mean there's no space? I managed to ask, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. The silence that followed felt loaded with everything left unsaid between us. Finally, she sighed, and I could picture her pinching the bridge of her nose the way she did when she felt cornered. Well, your cousin Sarah is bringing her new boyfriend, and you know how important this relationship is to her. And Michael's twins are old enough now to need their own beds instead of sharing. Plus, your aunt decided to invite her stepchildren this year. Each excuse landed like another small cut, methodical and precise. We just don't have the room we used to have. I wanted to scream that I was her daughter, that I'd been coming to this retreat since I was in diapers, that my bedroom at the lake house still had my childhood drawings taped to the walls. Instead, I found myself nodding as if she could see me through the phone, as if agreeing would somehow make the rejection hurt less. I understand, I lied, the words tasting bitter. Maybe next year. Oh, you're being so mature about this. I knew you'd understand. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than anything else she could have said. She'd been counting on my compliance, my willingness to step aside without making waves, and I was giving her exactly what she expected. After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The morning sun streamed through my windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, oblivious to the fact that my world had just shifted on its axis. I thought about calling my sister Emma, who would undoubtedly have a spot reserved, despite living 3 states away and visiting the family maybe twice a year. I thought about calling my father, who would mumble something about how these things work themselves out while clearly having no intention of working anything out himself. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I opened my laptop and began researching flights to Colorado. Not to beg for a place at the family table, but to book my own accommodation nearby. If they didn't want to make space for me, I'd make my own space. And I'd make sure they knew exactly what they were missing. The plan formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I would rent a cabin within walking distance of the family property. I would show up anyway, but on my own terms. I would be close enough to participate in the group activities if invited, but independent enough that they couldn't claim I was imposing. It was perfect in its passive-aggressive elegance. And as I clicked through rental listings, I felt the first spark of something that wasn't hurt or anger. It was determination. The cabin I found was actually nicer than any room I'd ever had at the family lake house. It sat on a small bluff overlooking the same lake, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a deck that wrapped around 3 sides. The photos showed a space that was modern and serene, with clean lines and natural materials that seemed to invite contemplation. It was expensive, more than I'd normally spend on a vacation, but something about this felt like an investment in myself. When I called to book it, the woman on the other end of the line had a warm, gravelly voice that reminded me of my grandmother. "Oh, you're going to love it up there," she said. "That particular cabin has something special about it. Previous guests always tell me they found exactly what they were looking for, even when they weren't sure what that was when they arrived." I didn't tell her I was looking for revenge, or vindication, or maybe just the simple acknowledgement that I mattered enough to be included. Instead, I confirmed the reservation and began planning the most strategic family vacation of my life. The 2 weeks leading up to the retreat passed in a blur of careful planning and mounting anxiety. I told no one about my cabin rental, not even my closest friends, who would have either talked me out of it or encouraged me in ways that made me question my own motivations. Instead, I threw myself into preparation with the thoroughness of someone planning a military operation. I bought new clothes, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to feel different, stronger. I chose pieces that made me feel confident, a flowing sundress in deep emerald that brought out my eyes, hiking shorts that showed off the legs I'd been working on in my morning runs, a leather jacket that gave me the kind of edge I'd never allowed myself before. Each purchase felt like armor, protection against the wounds I knew were coming. The night before I was supposed to leave, Emma called. "I can't believe Mom and Dad are being so weird about the space thing," she said without preamble, her voice tight with irritation. "I offered to share my room with you, but they said it was already decided. Since when do they make unilateral decisions about family events?" "Since always," I wanted to say. "Since the time they forgot to pick me up from school because they were dealing with your college drama? Since the Christmas they spent 2 hours discussing your career change while I sat silently in the corner? Since every family gathering where I somehow became invisible while everyone else's problems took center stage?" "It's fine," I said, instead, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I've made other plans." "Other plans? What kind of other plans?" I could hear the curiosity in her voice, tinged with concern. Emma and I had a complicated relationship, built on the foundation of birth order and parental favoritism that we'd never quite managed to address directly. She was the dramatic one, the one whose emotional needs had always seemed more urgent, more worthy of attention. I was the steady one, the one who could be counted on to manage her own problems without creating additional burden for everyone else. "I'm still going to Colorado," I said carefully. "I just won't be staying at the house." The silence stretched between us, filled with all the implications I wasn't ready to voice. Finally, Emma spoke, her tone softer than it had been moments before. "Grace, are you okay? This doesn't sound like you." That was the problem, wasn't it? This didn't sound like me because the me everyone knew was the one who accommodated, who stepped aside, who made herself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. But maybe that version of me had finally reached her breaking point. "I'm better than okay," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I meant it. The drive to Colorado took 8 hours, and I used every minute to rehearse conversations I might have, to imagine the looks on their faces when they realized I'd come anyway. The mountains grew larger as I drove west, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat, and something about their permanence steadied me. They'd been there long before my family drama, and would remain long after it resolved itself, one way or another. The rental cabin exceeded even the generous promises of the photographs. It perched on the hillside like a bird of prey, all glass and wood and commanding views. The key was hidden exactly where the owner had promised, and, as I stepped inside, I felt something shift in my chest. This space was mine, chosen by me, paid for by me. No one could ask me to leave, or make me feel unwelcome here. I spent the first hour exploring every corner, claiming the space in a way I'd never been able to claim space in my family's presence. The master bedroom had a window seat that looked directly across the lake to where I knew the family house sat, though it was hidden by trees from this angle. The kitchen was stocked with everything I might need, and the refrigerator hummed quietly, waiting to be filled with food I would choose for myself. As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the deck. The family house was visible now, lights beginning to twinkle in its windows, and I could almost imagine the sounds of arrival, the chaos of multiple families converging on shared space, the negotiations over bedrooms and bathroom schedules that had been part of these gatherings for as long as I could remember. Except this year, those negotiations had happened without me. This year, I was the problem that had been efficiently solved by my removal from the equation. I raised my glass toward the distant house in a toast to my own independence. And as I did, I saw headlights turning into the long driveway that led to the family property. The retreat was officially beginning, and for the first time in my life, I would be watching it from the outside. Morning came with the kind of clarity that only exists at altitude, where the air is thin and the light seems to cut through everything without obstruction. I woke naturally, without an alarm, in a bed that was mine, alone. No cousins chattering in the next room, no aunt doing her morning yoga routine in the common area, no grandmother shuffling around the kitchen at 5 a.m. because she'd never adjusted to mountain time. Just silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore far below. I made coffee in my own kitchen, using beans I'd ground myself, and carried the mug onto the deck to watch the lake wake up. From this vantage point, I could see the family dock where my cousins had taught me to dive, where I'd spent countless summer mornings reading books while my feet dangled in the cold water. The dock looked smaller from up here, less significant than it had seemed when I was 8 years old. and it represented the center of my universe. My phone buzzed with the first of what I assumed would be many messages. Emma, as predicted, we got here last night, where are you staying? Mom keeps asking if I've heard from you. I typed and deleted several responses before settling on something appropriately vague. I'm around. Enjoying the mountains. The next message came from my cousin Michael. Hey stranger, heard you're not staying at the house this year. Everything, okay. Then Sarah, Mom said you couldn't make it, but Emma said you're here somewhere. Confused, but hoping to see you. Each message was a small reminder that my absence had been noticed. That the official narrative of no space wasn't sitting well with everyone. I found myself smiling as I realized that my parents' solution had created more questions than it had answered. By mid-morning, I'd received invitations to join the family for their traditional first-day hike, for lunch on the deck, for the evening campfire that would kick off a week of shared activities. Each invitation was kindly meant but carried the underlying assumption that I was somewhere nearby, waiting to be included on their terms. Instead, I drove into town and spent the morning exploring the small mountain community that had grown up around the lake. I browsed the local bookstore, where the owner recommended a novel about family secrets that made me laugh at the coincidence. I bought supplies for a picnic lunch and drove to a trailhead I'd never visited before. Despite 28 years of family vacations in this area, the hike led to a waterfall that cascaded down granite cliffs into a pool so clear I could see every stone on the bottom. I ate my lunch on a boulder that jutted into the pool, my feet dangling in water so cold it made my ankles ache. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about my family or their retreat or the carefully orchestrated drama I'd set in motion. I was just present, alone, and surprisingly content. It was there, sitting by that waterfall, that I realized something profound had shifted. The hurt I'd been carrying since that phone call hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. Clarity, maybe, or permission. Permission to stop trying so hard to earn a place that should have been mine by birthright. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I found a car in the driveway. Emma sat on the front steps, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. She stood as I approached, and I could see she'd been crying. How did you find me? I asked, though I wasn't really surprised. Emma had always been resourceful when she wanted something. I called every rental company in town until someone admitted they had a Grace Martinez on their books, she said. That's some view you've got here. We stood there for a moment, sisters separated by more than just the distance between the deck and the driveway. Finally, Emma spoke again, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. They're all acting like nothing's wrong, but everyone can feel it. The whole dynamic is off without you there. Mom keeps snapping at people, Dad's been hiding in the workshop since this morning, and Grandma asked me 3 times where you are. And what do you tell her? I asked. The truth. That I don't know why you're not welcome in your own family. The words hung between us, finally giving voice to what we'd both been thinking but neither had been willing to say. Emma climbed the steps to where I stood, and for the first time in years, she hugged me without agenda, without needing something from me. I'm sorry, she whispered against my shoulder. I should have fought harder. I should have made them explain why my sister suddenly doesn't matter enough to make room for. Standing there on my own deck, holding my sister while the sun set behind the mountains, I realized that my plan for revenge had become something else entirely. It had become a catalyst for truth. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was still in my pajamas, enjoying my second cup of coffee and the luxury of having nowhere to be, when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I watched my grandmother navigate the wooden steps with the careful determination of someone whose body was failing but whose spirit remained fierce. I opened the door before she could knock, and she stood there studying me with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. At 86, Grandma Rose was still the unofficial head of the Martinez family, the one whose opinions carried weight and whose disappointment could reduce grown adults to apologetic children. So this is where you've been hiding, she said, pushing past me into the cabin with the familiarity of someone who'd never encountered a space she wasn't welcome in. Nice place. Better than that chaos down the hill. I followed her as she examined my temporary home with the thoroughness of a real estate appraiser, running her fingers along the countertops, peering out the windows, nodding approvingly at the well-stocked bookshelves. Finally, she settled into the chair that faced the lake and patted the sofa beside her. Sit, she commanded, and despite being nearly 30 years old, I obeyed without question. Your mother thinks she's protecting the family peace, Grandma, Rose began without preamble. Your father thinks if he stays quiet long enough, the problem will solve itself. Your sister feels guilty but doesn't know how to fix it, and you're up here playing some kind of elaborate game of chicken with people who raised you better than this." The criticism stung because it carried the ring of truth. "They told me there wasn't room for me," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "And, instead of fighting for your place, you bought your own palace and disappeared." Very dramatic, very effective, and completely beside the point. She reached over and took my hand in hers, her skin paper-thin but her grip surprisingly strong. "You want to know why there wasn't room for you, baby girl? Because you never demanded room. You spent 30 years making yourself smaller so everyone else could be bigger, and eventually, they forgot they needed to save space for someone who never took up much space to begin with." The words hit harder than any anger or accusation could. Have I thought about all the times I'd stepped aside, compromised, accommodated? The family dinners where I'd eaten whatever was left after everyone else had taken their preferences. The holiday plans that were made around everyone else's schedules. The phone calls where I listened to other people's problems but rarely shared my own. "That doesn't make it right," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "No, it doesn't. But it makes it understandable." She shifted in her chair to face me more directly. "Your parents made a mistake. A big one. But you've been making the same mistake for years, just in the opposite direction. You've been so busy proving you don't need anything from anyone that you forgot to tell people what you do need." We sat in silence for a while, watching the lake reflect the morning light like scattered diamonds. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You know what I think? I think this whole retreat mess was the best thing that could have happened to you. Not because you deserved to be excluded, but because you needed to remember that you have choices. You needed to remember that you can create your own space instead of waiting for someone else to offer you theirs." She stayed for lunch, regaling me with stories about the early years of the family retreat, when it was just her and my grandfather and their 3 children in a tiny rented cabin. "We were practically sleeping on top of each other," she laughed. "But we made it work because we wanted to be together more than we wanted to be comfortable." The implication was clear. If my parents had wanted me there badly enough, they would have found a way to make it work. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, I made a decision. I walked down the hill to the family house, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the back deck, and I could smell the familiar scent of my father's barbecue sauce mixing with the pine-scented mountain air. I didn't knock. Instead, I walked around to the back of the house where everyone was gathered, and simply appeared at the edge of the deck like a ghost returning to haunt familiar ground. "TM, not here to rejoin your retreat," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. The weeks following my return from Colorado passed in a strange limbo of waiting. I'd thrown down a gauntlet, made my dramatic exit, and now I was left to wonder what the consequences would be. My phone remained stubbornly quiet, free of the usual family group chat notifications and casual check-in calls that had previously punctuated my days. The silence felt both liberating and terrifying. Emma was the first to break the standoff. Appearing at my apartment on a Thursday evening, with Thai food and an expression that suggested she was prepared for a long conversation, we ate in relative quiet, the familiar comfort of shared meals bridging the gap between us until she finally set down her chopsticks and looked at me directly. "Mom's been impossible since you left," she said. "She keeps insisting that you're being dramatic and that this whole thing will blow over, but she's been stress cleaning the house for 2 weeks. You know how she gets when she feels guilty but won't admit it." I did know. Our mother's guilt manifested in obsessive organization, as if creating perfect order in her physical environment could somehow compensate for the chaos in her emotional one. "And Dad?" I asked. "Dad's been building birdhouses in the garage. So far he's made 7, and we don't even have a yard big enough for one." Emma smiled ruefully. "They're both miserable, but they're also both too stubborn to make the first move." "I'm not asking them to make the first move," I said, and realized as I spoke the words that this was true. "I'm not asking them to do anything at all. I just needed them to know that their actions have consequences." "But you miss us," Emma said, and it wasn't a question. I considered lying, maintaining the facade of complete independence I'd been cultivating. Instead, I nodded. "I miss you. I miss the good parts of being part of something bigger than myself. I don't miss feeling invisible or expendable." "You were never invisible," Emma protested, but even she seemed to hear the hollowness in her own Words. That conversation with Emma marked the beginning of something new between us. She started texting me more regularly, not with family drama or crisis management, but with small observations about her day, funny stories from work, random thoughts that didn't require any response from me except acknowledgement. It was the kind of casual, ongoing contact I'd always wanted but never known how to ask for. 2 weeks later, Michael reached out. My cousin had always been the peacemaker in our extended family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found diplomatic solutions to long-standing grudges. His text was characteristically direct. Coffee tomorrow. I have something to show you. We met at a cafe downtown, and he produced a tablet loaded with photos from the retreat's final days. I thought you should see these, he said, swiping through images that showed my family in various states of forced merriment. Everyone was smiling, but the smiles looked strained, performative. Even in photos, the absence I'd created was palpable. Look at this one, Michael said, stopping on a group shot taken during the traditional final night campfire. Everyone was gathered around the fire pit, but there was an obvious gap in the circle. A space where I should have been sitting. No one had moved to fill it. Sarah kept looking toward the hill where your cabin was, he continued. And Grandma, Rose spent most of the week telling stories about you as a kid. Like she was trying to make sure no one forgot you were supposed to be there. I studied the photos with the detached fascination of an anthropologist examining evidence of some distant culture. These people were my family, and yet from this perspective, they looked like strangers performing elaborate rituals I no longer understood. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, Michael said carefully. I'm trying to show you that your absence mattered. It changed everything, even when everyone was pretending it didn't. Good, I said, and meant it. It should have changed everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My father, the man who'd spent decades avoiding confrontation through strategic silence, showed up at my office on a Friday afternoon. My secretary announced him, with the bemused tone she reserved for particularly unusual visitors, and I found him in the lobby clutching a small wooden birdhouse painted in shades of blue and green. I made this for you, he said without preamble, holding out the birdhouse like an offering. I know you don't have anywhere to hang it, but I thought maybe someday you might. We stood there in the marble lobby of my office building, surrounded by the busy hum of downtown life, and for the first time in years, my father looked directly at me. Really looked, as if he was seeing me as a person rather than just another family member whose needs could be managed from a distance. I was wrong, he said simply. We were wrong. We got so used to you being understanding that we forgot you might need understanding too. The birdhouse was beautiful, crafted with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything my father made with his hands. It was painted to look like a tiny version of our family lake house, complete with miniature windows and a small front porch. There's always been room for you, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. There will always be room for you. I'm sorry it took us so long to say that out loud. I took the birdhouse, feeling its weight in my hands, and realized that this was what I'd been waiting for. Not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement. Recognition that I existed, that I mattered, that my presence or absence had the power to change things. Thank you, I said, and meant it in ways that encompassed far more than gratitude for a handmade gift. The invitation came 3 months later, handwritten on the thick cardstock my mother reserved for formal occasions. Not an email or a casual phone call, but a proper invitation that arrived in my mailbox alongside bills and promotional offers. Distinguished by the careful cursive that had addressed birthday cards and graduation announcements throughout my childhood, the Martinez family cordially invites you to join us for a weekend retreat to celebrate Grandma Rose's 87th birthday, October 15th to 17th, at the family lake house. Your presence would make this celebration complete. I turned the card over in my hands, noting the small details that betrayed how much thought had gone into its creation. The paper was cream-colored, elegant but not ostentatious. The wording was formal enough to convey respect but warm enough to suggest genuine desire for my company. At the bottom, in my grandmother's spidery handwriting, was a single line, "It won't be the same without you, sweetheart." The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days while I wrestled with my response. The hurt from the summer had healed, but it had left scars, a heightened awareness of my own worth and a reluctance to put myself in situations where that worth might be questioned again. I'd grown comfortable in my independence, found peace in the space I'd created for myself, but I'd also grown tired of defining myself in opposition to my family's expectations. The person I'd become in the months since Colorado wasn't someone who ran away from difficult conversations or avoided situations that might be uncomfortable. She was someone who showed up authentically, on her own terms. I called my grandmother directly, bypassing the chain of family communication that usually filtered through my parents or Emma. Her voice was frailer than it had been during her visit to my cabin, but her spirit remained undaunted. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said without waiting for me to identify myself. "Are you going to make an old woman beg for her birthday wish?" "I'll come," I said, surprised by how easily the words came, "but I want to drive up separately, and I'd like to stay in the guest cottage instead of the main house." The guest cottage was a small building that sat at the edge of the property. Originally built as my grandfather's woodworking shop but converted years ago into additional sleeping space, it was private without being isolating, connected to the family property but maintaining its own independence. "Done," Grandma Rose said immediately. "Though I have a feeling you won't be spending much time hiding away from the rest of us." She was right, though not in the way I'd expected. When I arrived that Friday evening, I found myself walking into a family dynamic that had subtly but significantly shifted. My parents greeted me with careful warmth, neither overwhelming me with effusive apologies nor treating me with the cautious distance they might use with a recovering invalid. Emma hugged me without drama, and my cousins welcomed me back with the easy affection of people who'd missed me but weren't going to make it weird. Most surprising was the space they'd created for me, not just physical space, though my preference for the cottage had been respected and accommodated without question, but emotional space, room for me to be present on my own terms, to contribute to conversations without being expected to manage everyone else's feelings, to exist as myself rather than as the family member who could be counted on to go along with whatever everyone else wanted. Saturday morning brought the traditional family hike, but this year's route was chosen with consideration for Grandma Rose's limitations and everyone else's varying fitness levels. We walked slowly through the aspen groves, their leaves golden in the October light, and I found myself naturally falling into step beside my father. The months that followed, that October weekend, established a new rhythm for my relationship with my family. It wasn't the effortless closeness I'd sometimes envied in other families, but it was honest, built on mutual respect rather than assumption and habit. My parents began including me in decisions that affected family gatherings, asking for my input rather than expecting my compliance. Emma and I developed a friendship that existed independently of our roles as daughters and sisters. My cousins reached out more regularly, and I found myself looking forward to their calls rather than dreading them as potential sources of family drama. But the real test came the following spring, when my mother called with news that Grandma Rose had fallen and broken her hip. "She's going to need surgery, and then several weeks of recovery," Mom said, her voice tight with worry. "We're trying to figure out the best way to coordinate care for her." In the old dynamic, this would have been the moment when I'd volunteer for whatever was needed, regardless of how it affected my own life. I'd have taken time off work, rearranged my schedule, and thrown myself into caretaking with the desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to prove her worth through service. Instead, I asked questions. What kind of care did Grandma Rose actually need? What were the other family members able to contribute? What would be most helpful versus what would simply make everyone feel like they were doing something? "I can take 2 weeks off work to help with the initial recovery period," I offered. "But I think we should also look into professional help for the longer term. She's going to need physical therapy, and none of us are qualified to provide that." The conversation that followed was a model of collaborative problem-solving that would have been impossible before my Colorado revelation. We divided responsibilities, based on each person's actual capabilities and availability rather than on unstated assumptions about who would sacrifice what for the family good. Emma coordinated with the medical team. My parents handled the logistics of preparing Grandma Rose's house for her return. Michael researched physical therapy options, and I took the first shift of hands-on care. Those 2 weeks at my grandmother's house taught me things about myself I'd never had the opportunity to discover. I was good at caregiving, but not in the self-sacrificing, martyr-like way I'd always imagined I should be. I was practical, efficient, and surprisingly good at advocating for what my grandmother needed from her medical team. I could be present for someone else's crisis without losing myself in it. More importantly, I learned that Grandma Rose, despite her injury and temporary vulnerability, remained the sharp, formidable woman who'd raised 3 children and managed a family with an iron fist wrapped in cashmere gloves. She didn't need me to manage her emotions or shield her from difficult realities. She needed someone to drive her to appointments, help her navigate the stairs, and provide company during the long hours of recovery. "You've gotten good at this," she observed one afternoon as I helped her work through the exercises her physical therapist had assigned. Taking care of people without trying to fix everything that's wrong with them. It was an accurate assessment. I'd learned to offer support without trying to control outcomes, to be helpful without being indispensable. It was a skill that served me well when I returned to my own life, only to discover that my promotion had led to new challenges that required the same kind of boundary setting. I'd been practicing with my family. My new position involved managing a team of analysts who'd previously been my peers. And I found myself drawing on the lessons I'd learned about claiming space and demanding respect. I could be collaborative without being accommodating, supportive without being a pushover. The confidence I'd discovered on that mountain deck in Colorado translated seamlessly into professional leadership. 6 months later, when the annual family retreat planning began, I received a phone call from my mother that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. "We're thinking about trying a different format this year," she said. "Maybe renting a larger house that could accommodate everyone more comfortably. Or splitting into smaller groups so no one feels crowded. What do you think would work best?" The question was genuine, not rhetorical. She actually wanted my opinion, valued my input in a way that acknowledged I had insights worth considering. It was such a fundamental shift from the phone call that had started this entire journey that I had to sit down. "I think," I said carefully, "that the format matters less than making sure everyone feels genuinely welcome. The lake house is special because of the memories we've made there, not because of how many bedrooms it has. So you'd be comfortable going back to the original house." I considered this. The lake house held complicated emotions for me. Now it was the site of my exclusion, but also the backdrop for some of my happiest childhood memories. More importantly, it was no longer the only space where I felt I belonged. I'd learned to carry my sense of home with me, to create belonging wherever I went. "I'd be comfortable anywhere we can all be together," I said. "As long as all actually means all." The retreat that summer was different in ways, both subtle and profound. The same physical space, the same traditional activities, but the underlying dynamics had shifted permanently. Conversations included everyone, decisions were made collaboratively, and conflicts were addressed directly rather than being smoothed over or ignored. I found myself appreciating things I'd taken for granted before. The way my father's eyes crinkled when he laughed at one of Michael's terrible jokes, the patient way my mother taught the youngest cousins how to braid friendship bracelets, the comfortable silence that fell over the group during evening card games. These were the moments that made family worth fighting for, worth the difficult work of learning to love each other better. On the last night, as we sat around the fire pit, sharing stories and making plans for the following year, Grandma Rose raised her glass of wine and a toast. "To family," she said, "and to the courage it takes to demand the love we deserve." Everyone drank, but I felt the toast was particularly meant for me. The granddaughter who'd learned to stop making herself smaller, who'd discovered that true belonging couldn't be given or taken away by someone else's decision about whether there was space for her. Later, as I packed my things in my childhood bedroom, the same room I'd been told there wasn't space for 2 years earlier, I reflected on how much had changed. The room looked exactly the same, but I inhabited it differently now. One belonged here not because I'd been granted permission, but because I'd claimed my place and refused to be moved from it. The drive home the next morning took me past the hillside where I'd rented that cabin, the place where I'd first learned that I could create my own space rather than waiting for someone else to offer me theirs. The cabin was occupied by other renters now, probably people seeking their own temporary escape from whatever complicated relationships had brought them to the mountains. I hoped they found what they were looking for. I hoped they discovered, as I had, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people who matter to you is to refuse to accept less than you deserve from them. 3 years have passed since that first phone call that changed everything, and I'm writing this from my own house, now a small craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough for the 7 birdhouses my father has made me since that day he appeared in my office lobby. Each one is slightly different, painted in colors that remind him of places we've been together or inside jokes we've developed. The latest one is designed to look like my house, complete with tiny shutters and a miniature version of the swing where I drink my morning coffee. The garden where these birdhouses hang is my own creation, planted with native flowers that attract the kind of birds my father researched. when he was learning what each house should accommodate. It's a small ecosystem of my own making, and watching it change with the seasons has taught me something about patience, about nurturing growth without trying to control every outcome. My phone rings most Sunday mornings now, not with crisis calls or guilt-laden requests for help, but with genuine check-ins from various family members who've learned to see me as someone worth staying in touch with. Emma calls to share gossip from her job or to ask advice about decisions she's facing. Michael sends photos of his twins, who are old enough now to remember me between visits, and ask when I'm coming to see them again. Even my parents have learned to call just to talk, without needing a specific reason or agenda. The most meaningful calls, though, come from my grandmother. At 90, she's slowed down considerably, but her mind remains sharp and her opinions as forcefully expressed as ever. She calls to discuss books she's reading, news stories that have caught her attention, or memories that have surfaced unexpectedly. These conversations have given me a deeper understanding of the woman who shaped our family's values. And through her stories, I've learned things about my own parents that help me understand the choices they made when I was growing up. You know, she told me during one of these calls, your grandfather and I went through a rough patch when your father was about your age. He thought we didn't appreciate him, and we thought he didn't appreciate us. Nearly stopped speaking for 2 years.